Everything in this house is mine and you are nothing." Thomas Caldwell's voice cracked through the air like a whip as he grabbed his wife by the wrist and dragged her toward the front door. With one savage motion, he snatched her bag from her hands and hurled it out into the pouring rain. Then he shoved her through the doorway, the same doorway of the house she had owned since before he ever knew her name. The door slammed so hard, the windows shook. Thomas straightened his collar, poured himself a drink, and smiled. He had just thrown the true owner of everything out into the cold and called it victory. If this story makes your blood boil, you're not alone. Subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and follow Emily's story all the way to the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The clock on the mantel read 11:47 when Thomas Caldwell made the worst decision of his life. He had been drinking. Not enough to be drunk, but enough to feel righteous. He stood in the center of the living room with the 12-foot ceilings and the Italian marble floors and the chandelier that cost more than most people made in a year, and he felt like a king passing judgment. Emily was sitting on the cream-colored sofa, the one she had picked out herself 3 years ago on a quiet Saturday afternoon, when he had been too busy to care about furniture. She was holding a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She hadn't been reading. She hadn't been on her phone. She had simply been sitting there waiting, the way she had been waiting for a very long time. "I want you to leave," Thomas said. Emily didn't look up right away. She set the cup down on the side table with the kind of deliberate calm that used to frustrate him and now made him furious. "I heard you the first time, Thomas," she said. "Then why are you still sitting there?" She looked up at him then. Her eyes were dark and steady. Emily Hartwell had a way of looking at a person that made them feel entirely seen, and Thomas had spent the last 2 years trying to escape that feeling. "Because I live here," she said simply. He laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the kind of laugh that men use to fill the space where their arguments should be. "You live here because I allow it," he said. "Everything in this house is mine, Emily. Everything I have built, everything I have earned, all of it mine, and I don't want you in it anymore." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at her hands. Then she looked back at him. "Is that really what you believe?" she asked. "It's what I know." She was quiet again. That terrible, infuriating quiet. "All right," she said. "If that's how you feel." "It is." "Then I'll go." She stood. She smoothed her blouse. She walked toward the staircase without hurrying, without stumbling, without giving him even the smallest piece of the reaction he had been building himself up for all evening. He watched her go with the satisfaction of a man who believes he has won something, and he poured himself another 2 fingers of scotch and sat down in the leather armchair that he liked to think of as his throne. He did not feel guilty yet. That would come later. For now, he only felt like a man reclaiming his life. He had been rehearsing this moment for months, maybe longer. The truth was that Thomas Caldwell had been unhappy for years, but he had only recently allowed himself to admit it. Unhappy men are dangerous in a particular way. They search for the source of their unhappiness, the way a wounded animal searches for the thing that hurt it, and they almost always land on the wrong answer. Thomas had landed on Emily. She was too quiet, too self-contained. She didn't laugh loudly enough at parties. She didn't wear the right things or say the right things or make the right people feel important. She existed in his world like a person who had wandered in from somewhere else entirely, someone who had never quite learned the language everyone around her was speaking. He had told himself this for so long that he had forgotten it wasn't true. What was true was this. Emily Hartwell had grown up in a family that had more money than Thomas would ever see in his lifetime, and she had spent every year of her adult life making absolutely certain that no one who didn't need to know that would ever find out. She was not quiet because she had nothing to say. She was quiet because she had learned a long time ago that the people who talk the loudest are usually the ones with the least to protect. Thomas had never understood that. He had never understood her. And now, on a rainy November night in Greenwich, Connecticut, he had told her to leave, and she was upstairs packing a bag, and he was sitting in a leather chair drinking scotch that she had paid for in a house that she owned, congratulating himself on his own courage. He heard her footsteps on the stairs 20 minutes later. She appeared in the doorway of the living room with a single bag over her shoulder. Not a suitcase, just the overnight bag she kept in the closet for trips. She was wearing her coat now, and her hair was pulled back, and she looked at him one more time. "I'll have someone come for the rest of my things," she said. "Take all of it," he said. "I don't want any reminders." Something moved across her face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness exactly. It was something closer to grief, but the contained kind, the kind that people carry when they have already done their mourning somewhere private. And this is only the last small confirmation of something they had known was coming. "Goodbye, Thomas," she said. She walked to the front door. She opened it. The rain was coming down hard now, and the cold air moved through the house like a held breath finally released. She walked out into it. He watched the door close behind her. He finished his scotch. He went to bed. He slept better than he had in months. That was Tuesday night. By Friday morning, his entire world would be gone. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened on Friday, and why it happened the way it did, you have to understand how Thomas Caldwell got to that leather armchair in the first place. You have to understand what he was, and more importantly, what he believed himself to be. Because the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves. Thomas grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a neighborhood where the houses were close together and the yards were small, and the fathers came home tired every evening, and the mothers made the money stretch further than it should have gone. It was not a bad childhood, but it was the kind of childhood that leaves a mark. His father, Gerald Caldwell, was a man who had started out with ambitions and ended up with a pension. He worked 31 years at the same manufacturing plant. He was a good man and an honest one, and Thomas had loved him the way sons love fathers, who are never quite what they dreamed they would be. "Don't end up like me," Gerald had said once when Thomas was 16 and had just won some school award or another. He said it with a smile, but Thomas had heard what was underneath it. The exhaustion, the small defeat. He had made himself a promise that night. He would not end up like his father. He kept that promise. He went to school on scholarships and loans and sheer willpower. He studied finance. He was smart, genuinely smart, the kind of smart that can be shaped into something very powerful or very dangerous, depending on what surrounds it. What surrounded Thomas when he was 28 years old and working his first real job at a mid-size investment firm in Manhattan was ambition and insecurity in equal measure. He was the kid from Dayton trying to pass as someone who had always belonged in rooms with good furniture and real art on the walls. He was very good at pretending. And then he met Emily Hartwell at a charity event in the spring. She was standing near the window holding a glass of water, watching the room with those quiet, measuring eyes. She wasn't the most beautiful woman there. She wasn't the most talked about. She was just still in the way that certain people are still, like they have somewhere real inside them to come back to. He had walked over because she was the only person in the room who didn't look like she was performing. "You're not enjoying yourself," he said. She looked at him. "Neither are you." That was how it started. They talked for 2 hours in that corner by the window while the party moved around them. She was funny. Not the practice kind of funny that you find at parties, but the dry sideways kind that catches you off guard. She asked him real questions and listened to the real answers. She disagreed with him 3 times that evening and was right every time, and he liked her more for it rather than less. He did not know that night that her family owned the building they were standing in. He did not know that the charity event itself had been organized and largely funded by the Hartwell Family Foundation. She never mentioned it. He never asked. They dated for 18 months, and he never asked about her background beyond what she told him casually, that her family was from Connecticut, that her father had passed away some years before, that she had a complicated relationship with money and didn't like talking about it. He thought he understood what that meant. He thought it meant something modest and a little uncomfortable, the kind of relationship people have with money when there hasn't been enough of it. I was catastrophically wrong, but Emily never corrected him, not because she was hiding something shameful, but because she wanted for once in her life to be with someone who was with her and not the name behind her. She wanted to be just Emily, not Emily Hartwell of the Hartwell family, not the heiress, not the trust fund. Just Emily, the woman by the window who could spot a faker at 40 yards. She had found that in Thomas, or thought she had, and in the beginning, she was right. The Thomas she married was not the Thomas who threw her out in the rain. The Thomas she married was hungry and humble and grateful and funny. He worked until midnight and came home and told her about his failures as readily as his victories. He asked for her opinion and meant it. He was in those early years genuinely the best version of himself. She was the reason for that. She just didn't know it yet. What she also didn't know was that Thomas was changing. Success does strange things to people. It answers some questions and raises entirely new and more dangerous ones. Thomas had spent so long trying to prove something that when the proof started arriving, he didn't know how to stop. He couldn't let himself rest in what he had built. He had to build more, always more. And the more he had, the more he needed the world to see it. The quiet dinners at home started to feel like lost opportunities to be somewhere impressive. Emily's preference for small gatherings started to feel like a limitation on his social life. Her reluctance to discuss money started to feel like she didn't appreciate what he was building. He started to see her stillness not as depth, but as emptiness. He started to see her silence not as peace, but as absence. He started to see her, in short, the way small men see women who are larger than they can understand. And that is when he met Olivia Bennett. Olivia was 34 years old and had the kind of energy that fills a room the moment she walks into it. She was a senior director at one of Thomas's partner firms, and she had a gift for making powerful men feel even more powerful than they already were. She laughed at Thomas's jokes. She asked about his deals with what seemed like genuine fascination. She deferred to his opinions in rooms full of people and then pulled him aside privately to let him know that she thought he was the smartest person there. She made him feel like a king. He had been married to a queen for 10 years and hadn't known it. "You deserve more," Olivia told him one evening after a conference dinner. They were standing near the bar, and she was close enough that he could smell her perfume. "A man like you, with everything you've built, you shouldn't have to come home to someone who doesn't see it." "Emily sees it," he said. But it was the automatic kind of defense, the kind with no real conviction behind it. Olivia smiled. "Does she?" "Because from where I'm standing, she looks like someone who's never had to work for anything in her life." And there it was, the lie that fit perfectly into the space that his ego had already prepared for it. He had worked for everything. Emily had worked for nothing. He deserved more. He repeated those sentences in various forms over the following months until they felt like facts, until they had the weight of truths he had discovered rather than fictions he had invented. He started coming home later. He started answering Emily's questions with single words. He started sleeping on the edge of the bed with his back to her in a way that was not accidental. She knew. Of course she knew. Women like Emily always know. But she didn't rage, and she didn't demand, and she didn't perform the crisis that might have jolted him awake. She had too much dignity for that. She watched, and she waited, and she grieved quietly, in the way she had learned to do everything privately, deeply, without asking anyone to witness it. She tried once to reach him. One Sunday morning in October, 5 weeks before he threw her out, she sat down across from him at the kitchen table while he was drinking his coffee and looking at his phone, and she said, "Thomas, I need you to look at me." He looked up. He was impatient. It was there in his eyes. "I know things are wrong between us," she said. "I know you're unhappy. I don't know exactly what is causing it, but I know that it's real, and I don't want to pretend it isn't. So I'm asking you, not demanding, asking, can we talk about it? Can we try?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm fine," he said. "Everything is fine." "It isn't. Emily, I have a lot going on right now. The Mercer deal is closing next week, and I don't have the bandwidth for your marriage." He said nothing. She looked at him with those eyes that saw everything, and then she looked down at her hands, and then she stood up and carried her coffee cup to the sink and stood with her back to him for a moment. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." She walked out of the kitchen. He went back to his phone. That was the last real conversation they had before the night he threw her out. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because it never occurred to him to ask, was what Emily did in the 2 days after that kitchen table conversation. She called her lawyer, not because she was angry, not because she was retaliating, but because Emily Hartwell had grown up in a family of people who understood that hope and preparation are not opposites, and that the most loving thing you can do sometimes is to be ready. She didn't tell her lawyer to file anything. She didn't initiate anything. She simply made sure that everything was in order, that the documents were current, that the trusts were properly structured, that when the time came, if the time came, the truth would be easy to demonstrate and impossible to dispute. She told her lawyer, a careful man named Richard Whitmore, who had known her family for 30 years, "I hope I never need any of this, Richard." And Richard Whitmore, who had seen many things in 30 years of family law, said, "I hope so too, Emily, but I'm glad it's ready." 3 weeks later, on a rainy Tuesday night, Thomas told her to get out, and Emily Hartwell picked up her overnight bag and walked out into the rain with the composure of a woman who had already said goodbye long before she reached the door. She drove to the Whitmore house. Richard's wife Margaret opened the door before Emily even knocked. "Come in," Margaret said. "I'll put the kettle on." Emily sat at their kitchen table, not a marble table, not a 12-foot ceiling kitchen, just an ordinary table in an ordinary kitchen with a good woman making tea, and she told them what had happened. Richard listened. Margaret listened. When Emily was done, there was a silence. Then Richard said, "I'll be at the house tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. "Richard, I don't want to—" "Emily." His voice was gentle but firm. "He just removed you from your own home in the middle of the night. I'll be there at 9 o'clock. She nodded. She drank her tea. She slept in the Whitmore's guest room in a bed with a plain white quilt and a window that looked out at the neighbor's oak tree, and she lay in the dark, and she listened to the rain, and she did not cry. She had done her crying months ago. Now there was only what came next. Across the city in the house that stood on land that belonged to a trust that bore her family's name. Thomas Caldwell slept with his phone on the nightstand and the satisfying conviction that he had finally done what needed to be done. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea. The morning arrived with the specific cruelty of November mornings, gray and cold and without comfort. Thomas woke at 7, showered, dressed in his best charcoal suit, and went downstairs to make coffee in the silence of a house that felt for the first time in years entirely his own. He stood at the kitchen counter with his mug and looked out at the back garden, which was brown and stripped of everything now, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt free. I was already thinking about calling Olivia. He was already planning the conversation, imagining her voice, imagining what she would say when he told her it was done. He was so deep inside that imagining that he almost missed the sound of the doorbell at 8:59. He set down his mug. He walked to the front door. He opened it. Standing on the front step was a man in his mid-60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and the expression of someone who has delivered bad news so many times that he has learned to carry it without spilling it. He was holding a leather briefcase. He was wearing a dark blue overcoat. He looked at Thomas with eyes that held no malice and no judgment and no warmth, just information. "Mr. Caldwell," the man said, "my name is Richard Whitmore. I'm representing the interests of the Hartwell Family Trust. May I come in?" Thomas blinked. "I'm sorry, the what?" "The Hartwell Family Trust," Richard said. "Mrs. Caldwell's family trust. I think we need to have a conversation." Thomas stood there for a moment with his hand on the door. Then he stepped back. "Sure," he said. "Come in." He said it the way men say things when they are not yet afraid. He led Richard into the living room, the same living room where he had stood the night before with his arm pointed toward the door, the same marble floors and 12-foot ceilings and chandelier that cost more than most people made in a year. Richard sat down and opened his briefcase and removed a document that was, Thomas would later describe it, about 3 inches thick. He set it on the coffee table. He looked at Thomas. And then he said the words that Thomas would hear in his sleep for years. "Mr. Caldwell, I need to inform you that you do not have the legal right to reside in this property." The room went very quiet. Thomas heard his own heartbeat. "Excuse me," he said. "This property," Richard said, his voice even and unhurried, "is held in the name of the Hartwell Family Trust, of which Mrs. Emily Caldwell, née Hartwell, is the sole primary beneficiary. The property has never been jointly owned. It has never been transferred to your name. You have been residing here as the spouse of the primary beneficiary, but as of last night, when you requested that Mrs. Caldwell vacate the premises, that arrangement has been terminated." Thomas stared at him. "That's—" he started. Stopped. Started again. "That's not possible." Richard turned the document toward him and pointed to a page. "The deed," he said simply. Thomas looked at it. He saw Emily's name. He saw the trust name. He did not see his own name anywhere. He sat back in his chair. "There has to be a mistake," he said. But even as he said it, the certainty was draining out of his voice, the way warmth drains out of a room when someone leaves the door open. "There is no mistake, Mr. Caldwell. This house, I helped pay for this house." Richard turned to another page. "The property was purchased outright by the Hartwell Family Trust 8 years ago, prior to your relocation from Manhattan. The purchase required no mortgage and no contribution from your personal finances." Thomas opened his mouth, closed it. "The renovation in 2019, he said. "I paid for that." Another page. The renovation was funded by a personal loan from Mrs. Caldwell to the joint household account, which you have already fully repaid. Every argument Thomas reached for dissolved the moment Richard touched a page. It was not a conversation. It was a demolition. And it was only the beginning. Mr. Caldwell, Richard continued in the same measured, almost gentle tone, I also need to discuss the matter of Caldwell Capital Management. Thomas went very still. What about it? The initial capitalization of Caldwell Capital Management, the $2 million seed investment that allowed you to leave your former employer and establish your own firm, came from a discretionary account held by the Hartwell Family Trust. The blood left Thomas's face. That was... He stopped. He remembered the conversation. 8 years ago. Emily sitting across from him at a restaurant, telling him she believed in him, telling him she wanted to help, telling him she had access to some funds from her family and she wanted to invest them in him. He had thought it was a few $100,000. He had thought it was her personal savings. He had thought of it as her belief in him rather than capital. He had paid it back. He had paid it back with interest, and he had been proud of himself for doing it. He had never once asked what account it came from. Furthermore, Richard said, 3 of your firm's largest institutional clients were introduced to you through the professional networks of the Hartwell Family Foundation. The room was moving. Thomas gripped the arm of his chair. And your current position on the board of directors of Meridian Trust, Richard continued, and Thomas heard his own breathing, now heard it go shallow, was facilitated through Mrs. Caldwell's relationship with the Whitmore Pierce family, who hold a controlling interest in Meridian. Thomas looked at the document on the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at the chandelier above him. I thought about how he had stood in this room 12 hours ago, pointing toward the door, saying everything is mine, saying you live here because I allow it, saying I don't want any reminders. The absurdity of it arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a slow and terrible wave. He had thought he was standing on solid ground he had built himself. He had been standing on a foundation that someone else had laid, had paid for, had maintained, had quietly protected, even as he grew too proud to look down and notice it. And now she was gone, and the foundation was still there, but without the protections she had provided, it would begin to shift. That was Wednesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Thomas had called his lawyer. His lawyer had reviewed the documents and called him back with a voice full of the particular caution that lawyers use when the news is very bad. Thomas, his lawyer said, I have to be honest with you. Just tell me. The trust documents are airtight. The property is hers. The seed investment was a personal loan fully repaid, so there's no claim there. As for the board position, the Whitmore Pierce family has already been in contact with the Meridian board. They've indicated that your relationship with the family has changed and that they may wish to revisit your appointment. Thomas was quiet. And the clients, he said. The Hartwell Network clients. A pause. 2 of them have already sent communications indicating they're reviewing their contracts with your firm. Thomas sat in the leather chair in the living room of the house he did not own, surrounded by the life he had not actually built, and he stared at nothing. This was Wednesday evening. He had not spoken to Olivia yet. He tried to call her Wednesday night. She didn't answer. He texted her. She responded 4 hours later with a message that said she was in meetings all week and would catch up soon. He called again Thursday morning. She answered on the 4th ring, and her voice had a quality to it that he recognized immediately because he had used that voice himself, the careful, slightly too breezy quality of someone who has already made a decision and is only waiting for the right moment to implement it. Olivia, I need to talk to you. Of course, what's up? I need to see you. Can we meet today? A pause. Today's really tough, Thomas. I have back-to-back meetings until... Olivia. His voice came out harder than he intended. I just lost my board position at Meridian. 2 of my largest clients are reviewing their contracts. I threw my wife out of the house 2 nights ago, and it turns out I'm the one who has to leave. So when you say today is really tough, I need you to understand that it is considerably tougher for me. Another pause, longer this time. Then Olivia said, Thomas, I'm so sorry that's all happening. That sounds incredibly stressful. Something cold moved through him. Are you going to see me? He asked. I have so much going on right now, and things feel really complicated, and I think, are you going to see me, Olivia? Yes or no? The longest pause of all. "I think maybe we both need a little space right now," she said, "to figure things out. Don't you think?" He didn't answer. He ended the call. He set the phone down on the marble coffee table. He sat in the leather chair in the living room of the house he didn't own, in the business he hadn't really built, in the life he had not actually constructed with his own hands, and he sat very still. And for the first time in many years, Thomas Caldwell told himself the truth. He said it quietly out loud with no one to hear it but the chandelier and the Italian marble floors and the gray Connecticut November pressing against the windows. "What have I done?" Thomas did not sleep in on Wednesday. He was up at 6:45 sharp and certain the way. Men are sharp and certain when they believe they have finally done the thing they should have done a long time ago. He showered. He dressed in the charcoal suit that his assistant had picked up from the tailor the week before. He went downstairs and made coffee in his kitchen and stood at the counter and felt with every sip more and more like himself. Not the himself that had existed for the last 10 years of marriage. The other one. The one from before. The one who had ambition and drive and a clear, uncluttered sense of direction. He called Olivia at 7:15. She answered on the second ring, which pleased him. "It's done," he said. A pause on her end. Then, "Are you serious?" "Last night. She took a bag and left. I'm having the locks changed this afternoon." Olivia made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a breath. "Thomas, how do you feel? Like I can breathe again," he said. "You sound like yourself." "I am myself," he said. Finally. They talked for 11 minutes. He did most of the talking. She listened and affirmed and laughed in the right places and said things like, "You deserve this," and "I knew you'd get there," and "I'm so proud of you." By the time he hung up, he was on his second cup of coffee, and the gray November morning outside felt less like November and more like something beginning. He did not think about Emily once during those 11 minutes. He thought about her at 7:58 when the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. He walked to the front door with his coffee mug still in his hand, mildly irritated at the interruption, and opened it. The man on the step was in his mid-60s. Silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, dark blue overcoat, leather briefcase held in both hands in front of him. He looked like someone's grandfather, if that grandfather also happened to be the most prepared person in any room he had ever entered. "Mr. Caldwell," the man said, "my name is Richard Whitmore. I'm an attorney representing the Hartwell Family Trust. I apologize for the early hour. I was hoping we might have a conversation." Thomas blinked. "The what trust?" "The Hartwell Family Trust," Richard said again, with the patience of a man who had learned that repetition was sometimes necessary. "Mrs. Caldwell's Family Trust. I believe you'll want to hear what I have to say." Thomas looked at him for a moment. The name Hartwell sat in his mind like a word in a language he half remembered from school. He knew Emily's family name was Hartwell. He knew she had mentioned a trust once or twice over the years in the vague, deflecting way she mentioned anything related to her family's finances. He had never paid much attention. He stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. He was still holding his coffee mug. He would set it down and never pick it up again. Richard followed him into the living room and sat down across from the leather armchair. He placed his briefcase on the coffee table and opened it with 2 clean clicks and removed a document that was to Thomas's eye approximately the thickness of a small novel. He set it on the table. He did not open it yet. He looked at Thomas. "Mr. Caldwell, I want to begin by saying that nothing I'm about to tell you is meant as a personal attack. My role here is simply to ensure that the facts of the situation are clearly understood by all parties." "That's a very lawyerly way to start a conversation," Thomas said. "Yes," Richard said. "It is." He opened the document to the first marked page. "This property, the residence at 114 Whitfield Lane, is held in the name of the Hartwell Family Trust, established in 1987 by Edmund and Catherine Hartwell, Emily's parents. Emily is the sole primary beneficiary of this trust. The property was purchased outright by the trust in 2016. It has never been held jointly, and your name does not appear on the deed in any capacity." Thomas felt the first cold thing move through him. It was not panic yet. It was something earlier than panic, something closer to the sensation of stepping onto ice and feeling it flex under your weight before it breaks. "I've lived here for 7 years, Thomas said. "Yes," Richard said, "as the spouse of the primary beneficiary. That status changed last night when you asked Mrs. Caldwell to vacate the property." "I didn't ask her to vacate. I asked her to leave." Richard looked at him steadily. I understand. The legal effect is the same. Thomas set his coffee mug down on the side table. He leaned forward. Let me be very clear with you, Mr. Whitmore. I have contributed to this household financially for the entirety of our marriage. 7 years of mortgage equivalent payments. There is no mortgage, Richard said. The property was purchased cash. The trust paid in full. Of maintenance of renovation costs. The 2019 renovation, Richard said, turning to a tabbed page, was funded by a personal loan of $240,000 from Mrs. Caldwell to the joint household account. The loan was fully repaid by you in 22 monthly installments, concluding in April of 2021. I have the transfer records here if you'd like to see them. Thomas stared at the page. He remembered those payments. He had made them feeling proud, feeling like a man who honors his debts, feeling if he was honest, slightly resentful that he had needed to borrow in the first place. He had never once stopped to consider what account that money had come from. He had assumed it was Emily's savings. He had assumed a lot of things about Emily that he had apparently never bothered to verify. The house isn't the point, Thomas said, and even as he said it, he knew it was the wrong thing to say. The weak thing, the retreat. The house isn't the whole picture. No, Richard agreed. It isn't. He turned to another section of the document. Shall we discuss Caldwell Capital Management? The ice under Thomas's feet flexed again. Harder this time. What about it? In March of 2015, when you left your position at Hargrove & Associates to establish your own firm, you required seed capital. You received a $2 million investment from a discretionary account managed by the Hartwell Family Trust. The room was very quiet. That was Emily's money, Thomas said slowly. She told me she wanted to invest in the firm. She believed in what I was building. She did believe in what you were building, Richard said. The investment was genuine, but the source of the funds was the trust, not personal savings. And the conditions of the investment as documented here, he turned another page, included a right of first review on any significant changes to the firm's ownership structure. Thomas was gripping the arm of the chair now. I paid that back, he said, every dollar, with interest. You did, Richard said, and that repayment is fully documented and fully credited. I'm not suggesting any financial impropriety, Mr. Caldwell. I'm establishing context. Context for what? Richard looked at him. Context for the full picture, he said, of how Caldwell Capital Management came to be what it is today. He turned to a new section. In 2016, 3 institutional clients, the Fennick Family Office, the Beaumont Charitable Foundation, and Greystone Partners, retained your firm for asset management services. These clients were introduced to you through the professional network of the Hartwell Family Foundation, of which Emily served as a board member. Combined, these 3 clients represent approximately 61% of your firm's current annual revenue. Thomas heard a sound. It took him a moment to realize it was coming from him. A short, involuntary exhale, 61%. He had done the math on that number before in a different context, in a quarterly review, feeling proud of his client concentration and the loyalty it represented. He had never once asked himself where those clients had come from in the first place. And finally, Richard said, and something in the way he said it told Thomas this was the last and worst thing, your appointment to the board of directors of Meridian Trust in 2020 was facilitated through Emily's long-standing relationship with the Whitmore Pierce family, who hold a 38% controlling interest in Meridian. Thomas said nothing. The Whitmore Pierce family became aware of the situation last evening, Richard continued. I spoke with their attorney this morning at 7 o'clock. They have requested an emergency review of your board appointment. The ice broke. Thomas felt it go. He didn't fall immediately because men like Thomas never fall immediately. They stand in the freezing water, and they keep their face arranged, and they process, and they hold. But the ice was gone, and the cold was rising, and it was in his voice when he finally spoke. She did this, Thomas said. She orchestrated this. Richard looked at him for a moment before answering. Mr. Caldwell, he said carefully. Emily did not contact me until this morning. The documents I have shown you have existed for years. The trust was established before you were born. The investment records are contemporaneous with the transactions themselves. Emily did not create any of this in response to last night. She simply stopped protecting you from it. That sentence landed like a physical thing. She simply stopped protecting you from it. Thomas sat back in his chair. He looked at the chandelier, the same chandelier he had looked at the night before when he had been pointing at the door feeling like a king. I thought about all the times over the last 10 years when deals had closed just slightly easier than they should have, when introductions had materialized at exactly the right moment, when obstacles had softened before he'd even had to push against them. He had attributed all of it to his own skill, his own reputation, his own relentless work. He had never asked why the ground was so smooth beneath his feet. He had never considered that someone might be walking ahead of him clearing the path. "What does she want?" Thomas asked. His voice was flat now. The grandiosity was entirely gone. "At the moment," Richard said, "Mrs. Caldwell wants you to vacate this property by the end of the week. She has arranged temporary accommodations for you at the Selden Hotel downtown. The costs will be covered for 30 days while appropriate arrangements are made." Thomas blinked. "She's paying for my hotel room." "Yes," he laughed. It came out wrong, too high, too short, the laugh of a man who has realized the joke is about him. "Of course she is," he said. "Of course she is." Richard closed the document and returned it to his briefcase. He clicked the latches shut. He stood up and straightened his coat. "I'll leave my card," he said. "When you're ready to discuss next steps, please have your attorney contact my office." Thomas didn't stand, didn't move. Richard placed his card on the coffee table. At the door he paused. He turned back. Something shifted in his expression, not pity exactly, but the closest thing to it that a man like Richard Whitmore allowed himself in a professional context. "Mr. Caldwell," he said quietly, "for what it's worth, Emily asked me to handle this with discretion. She specifically asked that nothing be made public. That was her instruction this morning, her first instruction." Thomas looked at him. "Why?" he said. Richard held his gaze. "Because that's who she is," he said. Then he left. Thomas sat alone in the living room of the house he did not own, and the silence that surrounded him was completely different from the silence of the night before. The night before, the silence had felt like freedom, like a cleared space, like room to breathe. This silence felt like the inside of something collapsed. He called his lawyer at 9:15. Daniel Cho had been Thomas's attorney for 6 years, a sharp and careful man who did not alarm easily and who had a gift for finding silver linings in bad situations. Thomas had always appreciated that gift. This morning he would find its limits. "Daniel," he said, "I need you to look at some documents and tell me if what I just heard is accurate." "What did you hear?" Thomas told him. "All of it. The house, the seed capital, the clients, Meridian." He talked for 8 minutes without stopping, laying it out in the sequential, organized way that his years in finance had trained him to present information, and when he was done, there was a silence on the other end of the line that was itself a kind of answer. "Thomas," Daniel said finally, "just tell me. I need to see the documents before I can say anything definitive. But based on what I've described." Another pause. "Based on what you've described, yes, that's an accurate picture." Thomas closed his eyes. "Can I fight the house? On what grounds, if the deed is in the trust's name and it always has been, you have no claim to the property itself? You could argue for reimbursement of expenses you contributed during the marriage, but those are already documented as a repaid loan, which actually works against you. The firm. The seed investment is repaid. You built the client relationships yourself over time, even if the introductions came through her network. That's going to be your strongest ground, that you earned and maintained those relationships through your own work. And Meridian, the longest pause yet. The Whitmore-Pierce family can initiate a board review at any time," Daniel said. "If they want you out, Thomas, they can get you out. The question is whether they want to and how motivated they are." "How motivated are they? How motivated is Emily?" Daniel said quietly. Thomas had no answer for that. "I had no idea what Emily wanted. He was realizing now with a sickening clarity, had any real idea what Emily wanted for a very long time. He had stopped asking. He had stopped being interested in the answer. He told Daniel he would have Richard Whitmore's documents sent over within the hour. He hung up. He sat still for approximately 4 minutes, which was the longest Thomas Caldwell had sat still, without a phone or a screen or an agenda in recent memory. Then he called Olivia. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Hey," she said. Her voice was different. Not dramatically different, not so different that he could have pointed to a specific thing, but different enough that the part of his brain that had been doing deals for 15 years registered it immediately as a shift in position. "I need to see you," he said. Today's really full. I have the Morrison presentation at 2 and the Olivia, I just found out I may lose the house, 2 major clients, and my seat on the Meridian board. Today is not a day where I need to hear about the Morrison presentation. A beat. Thomas, that sounds incredibly stressful. I just said that. I need to see you. Things are complicated right now, and I think maybe we both need a little time to... Are you serious? His voice went hard. Last week you told me I was the smartest man you'd ever worked with. 2 weeks ago you told me I deserved better than what I had. Now I actually make the move you've been pushing me toward for months, and you need time. I wasn't pushing you toward anything, she said, and her voice had cooled in a way he recognized immediately because he had used that same tone himself. The distancing tone, the management tone, the tone that means I am beginning to remove myself from this situation. Olivia. Thomas, I care about you, but I think maybe you've made some decisions in a very short period of time, and it might be worth stepping back and... Do you want to see me or not? The silence went on long enough to be its own answer. I think some space would be good, she said, for both of us. He ended the call. He did not throw the phone. He set it down with precise, deliberate care on the marble coffee table, which was a kind of violence of its own. He sat with the truth for the first time, not the comfortable edited version of the truth he had been living with, the actual truth. Olivia had not fallen in love with Thomas Caldwell the man. She had been drawn to Thomas Caldwell the position, the CEO, the board member, the man with the Greenwich address and the Meridian seat and the name that opened rooms. The moment those things began to dissolve, she dissolved with them. Emily had known that. I understood that now. Emily had looked at Olivia at the one company event he had brought both women to, that disastrous October dinner that he had told himself was nothing, and Emily had been perfectly polite and perfectly composed and had said nothing. Nothing at all, not that night and not afterward. But she had known. Of course she had known, because Emily always knew. He was still sitting in the same chair at 11:30 when his phone rang. It was Daniel. I've reviewed the Whitmore documents, Daniel said. And Thomas, it's accurate, all of it. The deed, the loan records, the client introduction documentation. All of it is exactly as described. Thomas breathed. The Meridian situation has also moved faster than expected. I received a communication from the Whitmore Pierce attorney 30 minutes ago. They're calling an emergency board meeting for Friday. To remove me. To review your appointment. Thomas, I have to be honest with you. Given the circumstances, I think the outcome of that review is not in your favor. Thomas looked at the document that Richard Whitmore had left on his coffee table. He had not touched it since the attorney left. It sat there like something geological, old and dense and entirely indifferent to his feelings about its existence. What is she doing? Thomas said. Not angry now. Something rawer than angry. Something closer to bewildered. What is Emily actually doing? Is she trying to destroy me? Daniel was quiet for a moment. From what I can see in these documents, he said slowly, Emily is doing very little. She's retained counsel. She's established her legal standing regarding the property. But the Meridian situation. The client concerns, I don't think she initiated those. I think those are moving on their own momentum because the connections were always hers. And now that the relationship has ended, those connections are simply... He paused, searching for the word, realigning. Thomas heard that word and felt it in his chest. Realigning. Not revenge, not orchestration, just reality settling back into its natural shape after years of being bent around his ego. That was in some ways worse. If Emily had been plotting against him, he could have pointed to her malice. He could have been angry. He could have made her the villain. But she wasn't plotting. She was simply standing still for the first time in 10 years and letting the world arrange itself around her actual power instead of the fiction of his. He had mistaken her stillness for weakness so many times that he had forgotten what it actually was. It was patience. It was the patience of someone who knew exactly who they were and had no need to prove it until proof was required. He was standing in her house. He had been standing in her house all along. By Thursday afternoon, 2 things happened almost simultaneously. The first was that Marcus Webb, the managing director of the Fenwick family office, called Thomas directly. Marcus was 63 years old and had known Emily's father, and he did not believe in being indirect. Thomas, he said, I've known about your situation since Wednesday. I want to be straight with you because I think you deserve that. Go ahead, Marcus. Fenwick has been with your firm for 8 years. We value the relationship. We value the work your team does. But I have to tell you that a significant portion of our comfort with the relationship has been, and I think you know this on some level, the Hartwell connection. Emily's father was a man of extraordinary integrity, and we have always thought of her as a continuation of that. Thomas said nothing. I don't know what happened between you and Emily, Marcus continued. I don't need to know, but I do need to know that the values we associated with your firm are still present, and right now I'm not sure of that. Marcus, I can assure you that the quality of our work hasn't changed. Thomas, a pause. The quality of the work was never the question. The line was quiet. I'll be in touch next week, Marcus said. Take care of yourself. He hung up. Thomas stared at nothing. The second thing that happened on Thursday afternoon was that his assistant, a young woman named Caroline, who had worked for him for 4 years, knocked on his office door and asked to speak with him. She sat down across from his desk. She was nervous. He could see that. She had never been nervous around him before. Mr. Caldwell, she said, I want to be up front with you because I think that's the right thing to do. I received a call this morning from a recruiter, from a firm I've been aware of for a while. She paused. I've decided to accept the offer. Thomas looked at her. You're leaving. Yes, I'm sorry. I know the timing is... When? 2 weeks. He nodded slowly. Is this because of what's happening? He asked. She met his eyes and he saw in her face that she was deciding how honest to be, and then she decided on all the way. I've worked very hard for you, she said. I know that. You know that. But I've also noticed things this past year that have made me think about what I want to be associated with. And the last few days have... She stopped, steadied herself. I wish you well, Mr. Caldwell. I genuinely do. She stood up. She walked out. He sat in his office after she left, and he thought about what it meant that even his assistant had been watching him, that even the person who scheduled his meetings and fielded his calls and kept his professional life organized had been watching him for signs of who he really was, and had apparently found the answer, and decided it wasn't what she wanted to be near. He drove back to Greenwich that evening. To the house that was not his house. He walked through the rooms. He looked at the things Emily had chosen, the furniture she had selected on quiet Saturday afternoons when he was too busy, the art on the walls that he had dismissed as her taste, the garden outside the window that she had planted herself over 3 summers on her knees in the Connecticut clay because she liked the idea of growing things. He had never once helped with the garden. He had never once asked what she was planting, or why she chose one flower over another, or what it felt like to put something in the ground and come back in a season and find it alive. He stood in the kitchen at 8 o'clock on Thursday night, and he opened the refrigerator and found behind everything else, behind the things he had bought and the things that were left over, a small container with a handwritten label in Emily's careful handwriting. It said, Butternut Squash Soup, November 3rd. She had made it 2 weeks ago. She had labeled it the way she labeled everything, with the date and the contents and nothing else. Just information, just care, just the small practical evidence of a person who was always thinking about what someone else might need, even when that someone else couldn't see it. He closed the refrigerator. He sat down on the kitchen floor. I didn't decide to do it. He was simply on the floor suddenly, with his back against the cabinet and his knees up in his charcoal suit that his assistant had picked up from the tailor, and he put his face in his hands. He didn't cry. Not yet. He just sat there in the kitchen of the house he didn't own, and he thought about a woman who had made soup 2 weeks ago and labeled it and put it in the back of the refrigerator where it would keep longest, a woman who had walked out into the rain without a scene and arranged for his hotel room, even as she arranged for her attorney, a woman who had told Richard Whitmore to handle everything with discretion because that was who she was, that was always who she had been. He had called her nothing. He had pointed at the door of her own house and called her nothing. He sat on the floor for a long time. When he finally got up, he took out his phone and he opened his contacts and he found her name, and he stared at it for almost a full minute. Then he put the phone in his pocket, not because he had decided not to call, but because he knew with a clarity that was new and painful and real that there was nothing he could say tonight that would be equal to what he had done. And Emily Hartwell had never had any use for words that weren't equal to the thing they were meant to address. He packed a bag. He took only what was his. He walked out the front door of 114 Whitfield Lane, and he did not look back at the house. He drove to the Selden Hotel. He checked in at the front desk, and the clerk handed him a room key and said, with the careful neutrality of hotel staff everywhere, "Your room has been prepaid, Mr. Caldwell, through the end of next month." He looked at the key card. He thought about Emily's handwriting on that soup container. I thought about all the things she had done quietly, all the years of it all, the careful and invisible labor of a woman who was by any measure one of the most powerful people in any room she entered, living as though she needed nothing from anyone, taking care of everyone who didn't deserve it. He rode the elevator up to the 14th floor. He unlocked the room. He sat on the edge of the bed in the silence of the hotel. Tomorrow was Friday. The Meridian Board meeting was at 10 o'clock. And Thomas Caldwell, for the first time in 15 years, had no idea what was going to happen next. Friday arrived the way bad days always do, quietly without warning, looking exactly like any other morning until it wasn't. Thomas was awake at 5:43. He hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch. The hotel bed was fine, the room was fine, everything about the Selden was tasteful and comfortable and completely wrong, and he had lain in the dark listening to the sounds of a building full of strangers and felt for the first time in his adult life genuinely lost. Not strategically lost, not temporarily off course, lost in the way that happens when a man removes every familiar landmark from his life and then realizes that the landmarks were not as he had believed things he owned. They were things that had been loaned to him by the patience and the love and the extraordinary quiet competence of a woman he had pushed out into the rain. He ordered coffee from room service at 6. It arrived in 12 minutes. He drank it standing at the window looking out at the city beginning to wake up, and he went over what he knew. The Meridian Board meeting was at 10 o'clock. He had spoken to Daniel again at 9 the previous night. Daniel had been careful with his words, but not careful enough to hide the truth underneath them. The Whitmore-Pierce family had already spoken to 4 of the 7 board members. The vote, if it came to a vote, would not go in Thomas's favor. He had a choice, Daniel had told him. He could attend the meeting, make his case, and let the board decide, or he could submit a voluntary resignation before 10 o'clock, which would at least allow him to control the narrative to say he had stepped down rather than been removed. "Which would you recommend?" Thomas had asked. Daniel had paused. "I'd recommend you spend the night thinking about what you want the next 5 years to look like," he said, "and make the decision that protects that future, not your ego right now." Thomas had not slept. He had, however, thought. He thought about it for 3 more hours at the window of the Selden, watching the city drinking coffee that kept arriving and going cold. At 9:15 he called Daniel. "I'll resign," he said. A pause. "I think that's the right call. Draft something clean, nothing apologetic, nothing that sounds like I was pushed." "Of course. Send it to the Meridian Board chair by 9:45. I'll have it done by 9:30. He hung up. He got dressed in a different suit, the navy one, not the charcoal, and he sat on the edge of the bed and he waited for 9:35 when Daniel called back to confirm that the letter had been sent. "Done," Daniel said. "Thomas, are you all right?" "I'll be in touch," Thomas said. I hung up. I was not all right. He knew that. But he had stopped asking himself that question the way men stop checking a wound when they've already accepted that it needs more than they can do for it alone. He sat in the hotel room until 11, when his phone began to ring with calls he didn't take. Numbers he recognized, board members, colleagues, people who had his number, because having his number had meant something 48 hours ago. He let every call go to voicemail. He read the messages without responding. They ranged from careful to curious, to one from a man named Frank Delgado, who he had considered a friend for 6 years, that said simply, "Heard the news. Call me when you're ready." He did not call Frank. He went downstairs instead and walked out of the hotel and into the Friday morning, and he walked without a particular destination, which was something he had not done since he was 22 years old. He walked for 40 minutes. At some point, he stopped in front of a coffee shop, not a chain, just a small place with a handwritten menu board and 2 tables on the sidewalk, the kind of place Emily used to pull him into when they lived in the city years ago, before Greenwich and Meridian and Caldwell Capital Management and all the rest of it. He would always be impatient back then, always have somewhere to be. She would order 2 things at the counter and bring them to the table outside, and they would sit and she would watch the street and he would check his phone and she would never once complain about it. He went inside and ordered coffee. He sat at the counter. He did not check his phone. He thought about Emily. He thought about where she was right now. He did not know. The Whitmore house probably, or perhaps she had gone to stay with her friend Catherine, who lived in the Back Bay in Boston, and had never liked Thomas much, and had never bothered pretending otherwise. He hoped she was somewhere warm. He hoped Margaret Whitmore had made her tea. He hoped she was sleeping. I did not deserve to hope those things. He hoped them anyway. He was still sitting at that counter at 11:50 when his phone buzzed with a text message. Not a call, a text, which meant the sender was deliberate about not wanting a conversation. He looked at the screen. It was from a number he didn't recognize, but the message identified the sender clearly enough. It said, "This is James Whitmore Pierce. I wanted to let you know personally that the board accepted your resignation this morning without contest. I also want you to know that what I'm about to say is not something I was asked to say by anyone. Thomas Emily never said a word against you, not to my family, not to the board, not in any conversation I've been part of. Whatever happened between you, she kept it entirely private. I thought you should know that." Thomas read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the counter and stared at the coffee in front of him. She had kept it private. She had every instrument of leverage that a person could want. She had the relationships, the history, the family name, the moral authority of a woman who had been thrown out of her own home in the rain by the man she had quietly built for a decade. And she had said nothing against him. Not because she couldn't, because she wouldn't. Because that was who Emily Hartwell was, and 10 years of marriage to a man who couldn't see it had not changed her. He sat with that for a long time. He paid for his coffee. He left. By 2 o'clock Friday afternoon, the news of his Meridian resignation had made the rounds of the professional community in the way that these things do not, through announcements, not through press releases, but through the quiet and extraordinarily efficient network of people who know people who know people. His phone had stopped ringing as much, which was its own message. When the calls slow down, it means the assessment has already been made. He went back to the hotel. He called his mother. Sylvia Caldwell was 71 years old and lived in the same Dayton neighborhood where Thomas had grown up, in a house that was smaller than the kitchen of the Greenwich property he had just vacated. She answered on the second ring the way she always did, because she kept the phone close when she knew things were hard. She knew things were hard. She always knew. "Tommy," she said. She was the only person on earth who still called him that. "Hi, Mom. Talk to me." He talked to her for 37 minutes. He told her everything, or most of everything, the parts that mattered, the house and the firm and the board, and Olivia, and most importantly, Emily. What he had said to Emily, how he had said it, what she had looked like walking out the door. He told his mother these things in the same order they had happened, without trying to arrange them in a way that made him look better, which was perhaps the most honest he had been with anyone in years. His mother listened. When he was done, there was a silence. "Tommy," she said, "I know." "No, you don't, so let me say it." Her voice was not unkind, but it was not soft either. It was the voice of a woman who had raised this man and loved him completely, and was not willing to let that love become an excuse. "You did a terrible thing. You had a good woman who loved you, and you looked right at her and told her she was nothing. You said that, those words." "I know, Mom. And now you're calling me because you want to feel better." He was quiet. "But I'm not going to make you feel better about this," Sylvia said. "What I'm going to tell you is what your father would have told you, which is that the measure of a man is not what he does when things are going well. It's what he does when he's standing in the wreckage of his own decisions." "I don't know how to fix it." "You probably can't fix it," she said. "Not the marriage. Some things you break and they stay broken, but you can fix yourself, and that has to come first. You understand me?" "Yes." "And Thomas." A pause. "That woman, Emily, whatever you've lost because of what happened, you deserve to lose it. But what she did for you all those years, you didn't deserve that. That was grace, and I hope to God you understand the difference." He did not have an answer for that. He thanked her. He told her he loved her. He hung up. He sat in the hotel room and he thought about the word grace and what it meant and what it looked like when it was standing in front of you, in a quiet woman holding a cup of cold tea, and you were too busy feeling powerful to see it. Friday passed. The weekend passed slowly, the way weekends do, when there is nothing to fill them with except yourself. Thomas had spent the last 15 years filling every hour with motion. Meetings and calls and dinners and strategies and projections. He had used busyness the way other people use medication to keep the deeper things from rising to the surface. Now the surface was completely still, and everything was rising. He thought about his father. Gerald Caldwell had worked 31 years at a plant and come home tired every evening and still found time to throw a ball and actually be there. Thomas had spent 30 years trying not to be his father, and in the process had become something his father would have been ashamed of. That thought arrived on Saturday afternoon and sat in his chest for the rest of the weekend. He called Daniel on Monday morning, and they met at Daniel's office at 10. They went through the full picture. Caldwell Capital Management still existed. The firm itself was intact. The staff was in place. The work was real. What was shifting was the client base. The Hartwell-connected clients were in various stages of review, and Marcus Webb at Fenwick had sent a formal letter indicating they would be evaluating their options at the end of the quarter. 61%, Thomas said. Yes, if they all leave. You lose 61% of annual revenue. The firm can survive that technically if you move aggressively on new business, but it won't look the same. Thomas nodded. What's my position on the house? Richard Whitmore has formalized the request for you to vacate by the end of the month. They're being generous with the timeline. Emily has not initiated any divorce proceedings yet. Something moved through Thomas at that. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated. She hasn't filed, he said. No, not yet. He thought about that. He thought about what it might mean, and then he told himself to stop thinking about what it might mean, because he had no right to that kind of hope. I need you to do something for me, Thomas said. What's that? I need you to contact Richard Whitmore and tell him that I will vacate the Greenwich property this week, not at the end of the month, this week, and tell him, he paused, chose his words, tell him that I would like any further communications regarding the property to acknowledge that Emily has been fully cooperative and generous in her handling of this situation. I want that on record. Daniel looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. You want to formally acknowledge her generosity? Yes. Thomas, that's not strategically necessary. I know, Thomas said. That's why I want to do it. Daniel wrote it down. On Tuesday morning, Thomas drove back to Greenwich for the last time. He had arranged a moving service for the previous afternoon, and his personal belongings, the clothes, the books, the small number of things that were genuinely his, had already been packed and were sitting in a storage unit near the Merritt Parkway. The house was still. The moving crew had been careful. Nothing was out of place. Everything that belonged to Emily was exactly where she had left it. He walked through the rooms one more time. He stood in the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator. The soup container was still there, still labeled in her handwriting. November 3rd. He closed the refrigerator. He left a note on this kitchen counter. He had thought about whether to do this for 3 days, and had decided that whatever the strategic or emotional calculus, it was the right thing and he was going to do it. He kept it short because he did not trust himself with length right now, with the eloquence that he was capable of, but that he had never used in her direction when it might have actually mattered. He wrote, I left the spare keys on the hook by the door. I did not take anything that wasn't mine. I am sorry, not for any legal or financial reason, but because what I said to you was wrong, and what I thought about you for the past 2 years was wrong, and you deserved none of it. You deserved the opposite of it. I know that saying so now is insufficient. I'm saying it anyway because you told the truth to me for 10 years, and I owe you at least this once. Thomas. He placed the note on the counter. He walked out. He did not look back. He drove to a small apartment he had rented in Stamford. Nothing like Greenwich, nothing like what he had been used to. A 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building that smelled faintly of someone else's cooking, and had windows that looked out at the parking structure across the street. He had picked it specifically because it was nothing, because he needed to understand what nothing felt like before he could understand what anything was actually worth. He carried his own boxes up. He did not hire help. He put things where they seemed to go. At 7 in the evening, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, a Connecticut area code, but not one he knew. He almost let it go. Then something made him answer. Thomas Caldwell, he said. A pause. Thomas. A woman's voice, older, familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place. Yes, it's Margaret Whitmore. He straightened in his chair. Margaret Whitmore, Richard's wife, the woman who had opened the door for Emily on Tuesday night and put the kettle on. Mrs. Whitmore, he said carefully, I'm not calling on behalf of Richard or officially on behalf of anyone, she said. I'm calling because I'm 70 years old and I have watched marriages for 50 of those years, and I feel entitled to say things that younger people are too careful to say. He waited. Emily did not ask me to call you, Margaret said. She would be mortified if she knew I was, so what I'm about to tell you is between us. All right. Emily has not slept properly in 4 days. She sits at our kitchen table in the morning and drinks her coffee, and she is perfectly composed, and she talks about practical things, next steps, logistics, what she needs to do, and when. She is remarkable, that woman. She has more self-possession than anyone I have ever known. Thomas was very still. "But I am her godmother," Margaret said quietly, "and I know her. And last night I heard her crying in the guest room at 2 o'clock in the morning. She didn't know I heard. She would have been horrified to know. She cried for 20 minutes, and then she stopped, and it was quiet. And this morning she came down to breakfast perfectly composed and asked if she could help with anything." He closed his eyes. "I'm not telling you this so you can feel guilty," Margaret said. "You should feel guilty, but that's not the point. I'm telling you this because Emily Hartwell has spent most of her adult life being strong on behalf of people who didn't earn it, and I think someone should know that it costs her something, even when you can't see it." Thomas couldn't speak. "She's going to be fine," Margaret said. "She's always fine, but fine is not the same as whole, and I think you should understand what you broke before you can have any chance of understanding what it would take to be a different person." A pause. "That's all I wanted to say." "Mrs. Whitmore," Thomas managed. His voice was rough. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Be better." She paused. "Good night, Thomas." She hung up. He sat in the empty apartment with the phone in his hand, and he thought about Emily crying at 2 in the morning and stopping herself and coming down to breakfast composed. He thought about what it cost to do that. He thought about all the times over the years that she must have done some version of that, contained herself, straightened herself, come downstairs composed while he moved through their shared life, completely unaware. He thought about the word she had used in his kitchen one Sunday morning. "Try. Can we try?" He had said everything is fine and gone back to his phone. He put the phone on the kitchen counter of his empty apartment, and he stood there for a long time. Then he did something he had not done in years, possibly decades, something that felt strange and necessary and overdue. He opened the cabinet under the kitchen counter, and he found the toolbox he'd brought from Greenwich, and he took out a hammer and a nail, and he hung a single small frame on the empty wall, a photograph he'd found in a box while packing one he didn't even remember taking. It was Emily. She was in the garden in what must have been the second summer, kneeling in the Connecticut clay with her hands in the soil, looking up at something just past the camera's edge. She wasn't posing. She didn't know the picture was being taken. She was completely absorbed in whatever she was, planting her face open and concentrated and alive, in the way that people are alive when they are doing something they genuinely love. He had taken that picture. He didn't remember why. Maybe because something in the moment had made him stop. Some instinct, some part of him that had not yet lost its ability to recognize something real when it was right in front of him. He stood back and looked at it on the wall. He had no plan. He had no strategy. He had no clear path to any particular outcome. But for the first time since Tuesday night, he had something honest, something true, something that was his, not the house, not the board seat, not the client list, but the actual reckoning with himself that he had been avoiding for years. He went to bed. He slept better than he had all week, not because things were resolved, but because he had stopped lying to himself. And sometimes just barely, that is where everything real begins. Wednesday arrived with the specific purposefulness that weekdays carry when there is finally something constructive to do with them. Thomas was at his office by 8. Not the Greenwich home office, the firm's actual office on the 14th floor of a building in Stamford, where his team of 9 had been working all week in the particular quiet of people who are aware that something large has shifted but have not yet been told exactly what. He called a staff meeting at 8:30. 9 people sat around the conference table. Some looked at him directly. Some looked at the table. All of them were waiting. He stood at the head of the table and he did not use notes. "I'm not going to pretend you don't know that things have changed," he said. "You're all smart people and this is a small community, and I won't insult you by acting like we're starting from the same position we were in 2 weeks ago." Nobody moved. "The Meridian board seat is gone. I resigned Friday. Several of our major clients are in review periods, and I think some of them will leave. I want to be honest with you about that because you all have lives and decisions to make, and you deserve real information." Sarah Chen, his senior portfolio manager, looked up. "All of them?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "Possibly not all, but enough that it matters. The revenue picture is going to look different by Q2. A silence. "What I can tell you," Thomas continued, is that the analytical work this firm does is genuinely excellent. That's real. That was never the question. What I need from each of you, if you're willing to stay, is the chance to rebuild the client base on the strength of that work. No shortcuts, no connections I didn't earn, just the work. He looked around the table. If anyone wants to leave, I understand. I won't hold it against anyone. I'd rather you tell me now than in 3 months. He paused. Take the day to think about it. Come talk to me this afternoon if you've decided. He sat down. The meeting ended. 3 people came to talk to him that afternoon. One of them, a junior analyst named Brendan, said he was taking another offer. Thomas shook his hand and thanked him for his honesty, and meant it. The other 2, Sarah and his compliance director, a quiet and meticulous man named Howard Park, said they were staying. I've worked for 2 other firms, Sarah said, sitting across from him. You're difficult sometimes, and your ego has been a problem. She said it without heat, just as information. But the analysis you do is genuinely good, Thomas. I want to see if you can build something real. I'm going to try, he said. That's not a plan, she said. No, he agreed, but it's a start. She nodded. She left. Howard came in after her, sat down, folded his hands. I have 2 conditions, Howard said. Tell me. First, monthly full-team transparency meetings. Revenue client status projections. Everyone knows everything. Done. Second, Howard looked at him steadily. You stop acting like you built all of this by yourself. You didn't. None of us did. We built it together. And whatever comes next, we build that together too. Thomas looked at him. Done, he said. Howard stood, reached across the desk. Thomas shook his hand. 7 people left, 2 stayed. Thomas started calling people that afternoon. Not the Hartwell Network clients, those he left alone entirely. He called people he had worked with early in his career, people who had known him before the Greenwich House and the chandelier and the board seat, people who had seen what he was actually capable of when he wasn't trying to be impressive. He made 11 calls that day. 3 of them resulted in second conversations scheduled for the following week. It was not a comeback. It was not a recovery. It was something smaller and more important. It was a man picking up a single stone and placing it deliberately with both hands in a place where something might eventually be built. He drove back to the Stamford apartment that evening. He passed the turnoff for Greenwich without taking it. He cooked dinner for the first time in years. Not anything elaborate, just pasta and a sauce from a jar and a salad. The kind of meal that no one serves at a business dinner. The kind of meal that his mother used to put on the table when money was tight and the refrigerator was mostly empty. He ate it standing at the kitchen counter. He looked at the photograph on the wall. Emily in the garden, her hands in the clay, her face turned towards something just out of frame. He did not know what she was looking at in that photograph. He did not know what she had been thinking. He had never asked. He had been standing a few feet away looking at her through a lens, and he had not thought to ask. He thought about what Richard Whitmore had said on Wednesday morning, standing at the door of the Greenwich House, one hand on the frame, looking back at the man who had just heard his whole life reordered. She is who she is, Richard had said. And Thomas, standing in the empty apartment in Stamford, eating pasta from a jar sauce, looking at a photograph of a woman he had failed, completely, thought about what it meant to finally know who someone was after years of not bothering to look. I thought about what it would take. Not to win her back, he was not entitled to want that yet, maybe not ever. But to become someone who deserved to be in the same room as her. Someone who could look her in the eye without the weight of all the unsaid and all the undone pressing down. He thought about what his mother had said. Some things you break and they stay broken. But you can fix yourself, and that has to come first. He washed his dishes. He turned off the kitchen light. He stood for a moment in the doorway of the apartment in the quiet of a Wednesday night in a building where other people were living their own complicated lives a few feet away through every wall, and he thought about what came next. Not as a strategy, not as a plan, just as a question. Who do you want to be when this is over? He didn't have a full answer yet, but for the first time he was asking the right question. The question Thomas had asked himself on Wednesday night did not go away when he woke up Thursday morning. It stayed with him the way real questions do, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, the way a stone stays in your shoe and changes how you walk, even when you're not thinking about it. I was up at 6. He made coffee in the apartment kitchen. He stood at the counter with the mug and the quiet, and he thought about the day ahead, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, the day ahead contained no performance, no room he needed to walk into and own, no table he needed to command, just work, just the actual work of rebuilding something from a position of honesty rather than borrowed authority. He was at the office by 7:30. Sarah was already there. She looked up when he came in, registered mild surprise, said nothing about it. She went back to her screen. He went to his office, sat down, and started making calls. The 3 conversations from the previous week had turned into 2 actual meetings, both scheduled for that Thursday afternoon. The first was with a man named Arthur Gaines, who ran a mid-size family foundation out of Hartford, and who had worked with Thomas briefly 6 years ago, before the Hartwell connections had made those smaller relationships feel beneath Thomas's attention. Thomas had stopped returning Arthur's calls in 2020. He had not examined why until now. Arthur was 68 years old, built like someone who had done physical work before he had money to pay other people to do it, and he had a handshake that meant something. They met at Arthur's office. Arthur did not waste time. "You want to pitch me on moving my portfolio management to your firm," Arthur said before Thomas had said anything beyond hello. "Yes," Thomas said. "Why should I? The last time we talked seriously, you blew off 2 meetings and had your assistant send a form email explaining you were too busy." Thomas did not flinch from that. He had prepared for it, had sat with it the night before, and decided that the only way through this version of the conversation was straight through, not around. "That was wrong," Thomas said. "It was dismissive, and it was exactly the kind of behavior that has cost me in ways I'm only now fully understanding. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen, or that I have a good explanation for it. I don't." Arthur looked at him for a long moment. He had the face of a man who had been sold things his entire life and had developed a very accurate internal instrument for detecting the difference between a pitch and the truth. "What happened to your Meridian seat?" Arthur asked. "I resigned." "Why?" "Because I had accepted it on the strength of a relationship that was no longer mine to rely on." Arthur was quiet. "The Hartwell woman," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "I knew her father," Arthur said. "Edmund Hartwell, remarkable man, believed that the point of having resources was to use them carefully, not to display them loudly." He paused and let that sit between them like a lesson. "Your firm's analytical work is strong," Arthur said. "I've had my people look at your track record independent of the client relationships. The numbers are real." "They are." "How much did you rely on Emily Hartwell's network to get those clients in front of you in the first place?" Thomas could have softened it. He chose not to. "Significantly," he said. Arthur nodded once. "All right," he said. "Here's what I'm willing to do. I'll give you a trial quarter with a portion of the foundation's discretionary account. Not the full portfolio, I'm not an impulsive man, but enough to see what your team can do when you're not standing on someone else's foundation." Thomas held the man's gaze. "That's fair." "It's more than fair," Arthur said. "Don't make me regret it." Thomas drove back to Stamford with the signed trial agreement on the passenger seat and something in his chest that wasn't quite hope but was in the same neighborhood. Not the loud, entitled optimism he had carried for most of his professional life. Something quieter, something that knew it had to be earned. He told Sarah when he got back. She read the terms, nodded. "It's a start," she said. "That seems to be the theme," he said. She almost smiled. Almost. The second meeting that afternoon was shorter and did not go as well, and Thomas drove home with that reality too, the reminder that not every conversation was going to bend his way just because he had decided to be honest. Some things were simply too far gone, and the honest thing was to accept that without trying to fix it through force of will. He was learning to sit with outcomes he couldn't control. It was harder than any deal he had ever closed. 2 weeks passed. They passed with the particular texture of early rebuilding, slow and unglamorous, full of small decisions that felt large because everything felt large now that the cushion of inherited position was gone. Thomas made calls. Some were returned, some weren't. He lost the Beaumont Charitable Foundation account at the end of the second week, confirmed by a letter from their managing director that was courteous and brief and final. He sat with the letter for 20 minutes and then put it in a file and went back to work. Marcus Webb at Fenwick Still had not made a final decision. Thomas had reached out once, a brief and genuine message, saying that he respected whatever Marcus decided and that the door to a conversation was open if Marcus wanted it. Marcus had not responded. Thomas had not followed up. He had learning when to press and when to wait, and when to simply let a thing be whatever it was going to be. Olivia Bennett's name appeared in a trade publication in the third week. She had been promoted. Senior Vice President, it said. There was a photograph of her at a company event holding a champagne glass, smiling the smile that Thomas now recognized as entirely constructed. He looked at the photograph for 3 seconds, and then scrolled past it and felt almost nothing, which surprised him, and then felt something sadder and more adult than nothing, which was the recognition that he had nearly ruined his life for a reflection of himself that she had been willing to provide. He did not miss her. He missed who he had been before he had needed her. On the Thursday of the third week, Richard Whitmore called. Not his assistant. Richard himself, which meant it was personal enough to warrant the direct dial. "Thomas," Richard said, "I'm calling with a piece of information that I've been authorized by my client to share with you. Emily has retained separate counsel to handle the divorce proceedings, a woman named Patricia Lund, who is a family law specialist in New Haven." Thomas felt it move through him. The word divorce formally spoken in the context of proceedings by a lawyer who was authorized to say it. "All right," he said. His voice was steady. "Emily wanted you to know directly through proper channels rather than have you served papers without warning. That was her specific instruction." Even now, even at the end, she was protecting him from the indignity of being surprised. "Please thank her," Thomas said, "through whatever channel is appropriate." A pause. "I will," Richard said. He paused again, and Thomas got the sense of a man choosing whether to say something he was not strictly required to say. "Thomas," Richard said, "I've known Emily since she was 9 years old. I was at her parents' wedding, and I was at her father's funeral, and I was at her wedding to you. I don't say this often because my professional role doesn't generally accommodate it, but I believe she chose you because she saw something in you that was worth choosing." Thomas waited. "I hope," Richard said carefully, "that you are in the process of finding out what that was." He hung up. Thomas sat in his office in Stamford with his phone on the desk, and outside the window the November sky was doing what November skies do, which is to say it was gray and low and entirely honest about the season, and he thought about Emily at 9 years old, in a world where Richard Whitmore was already someone who looked out for her, and he thought about what it meant that she had chosen him out of all the people who had wanted to be chosen by her. He had never thought about it that way. He had always thought of choosing Emily, of having picked her from the crowd at that charity event, of having walked over to the woman by the window. He had never considered that she had been choosing him just as deliberately, that those quiet measuring eyes had looked at him and made a calculation and decided he was worth the risk. He had been worth it once. He had to find out if he still was. Not for her. He didn't have the right to make this about her yet. For himself first. His mother had said it, and she was right. Fix yourself first. He started therapy that week. He had never been in therapy in his life. He had always categorized it in the way of men of his generation and his particular brand of ambition as something for people who couldn't manage themselves. He understood now that this categorization had been both wrong and convenient, a way of avoiding exactly the kind of uncomfortable internal examination that might have prevented all of this. His therapist was a man named Dr. Warren Elias, who was 62 years old and had the kind of stillness that Thomas was beginning to recognize as a characteristic of people who had actually done the work on themselves. He did not take notes during sessions. He just listened and occasionally asked a question that was so precise it felt like being handed a scalpel. The first session, Dr. Elias asked Thomas to describe the moment he had decided Emily was not enough for him. Thomas opened his mouth to talk about Olivia, about the flattery, about the comparison, about being made to feel undervalued. Dr. Elias held up one hand. "Not what changed from outside," he said. "What changed inside. What did you start believing about yourself that required her to be less than she was?" Thomas stopped. He sat with that question for 2 full minutes of silence. Dr. Elias did not rush him. "I think," Thomas said finally slowly, "that I started believing that what I had built was entirely mine, that I had done it alone, and once I believed that I needed everyone around me to confirm it, including her." "And she wouldn't confirm it," Dr. Elias said. "She didn't have to," Thomas said. "She already knew the truth." Dr. Elias wrote one thing in his notebook. Thomas never found out what it was. The sessions were in the vocabulary Thomas had always used for difficult things, productive. They were also in an entirely different vocabulary. He was just beginning to learn painful in the way that necessary things are painful, not random, not cruel, but precise. Each session reached into a place he had been careful to keep locked and asked him to look at what was there. I went every week without canceling once, which was itself a kind of progress because Thomas Caldwell had a 20-year history of canceling things that made him uncomfortable. December arrived. The divorce proceedings moved forward with the same quiet efficiency that Emily apparently applied to everything. Patricia Lund, her attorney, was extraordinarily competent and entirely unsentimental, and the process, while not painless, was conducted without drama or escalation. Thomas's own attorney told him, after the first round of paperwork, that Emily had made no punitive claims, had not attempted to challenge the ownership of Caldwell Capital Management, had not sought anything beyond what was legally and structurally hers. "She's being extraordinarily reasonable," Daniel said. "Yes," Thomas said, "she is. Most people in her position—" "I know Daniel." I knew. He had known Emily for 12 years, and he knew that her restraint was not strategic. It was not calculated to make him look worse by contrast. She was simply not interested in destruction. She had never been. She wanted what was hers, and she wanted to be left alone to live the life she had always been living underneath and around and in spite of him, and that was all. Christmas came. Thomas spent it in Dayton at his mother's house in the small living room with the low ceilings and the artificial tree that Sylvia Caldwell had been putting up for 23 years because it was the one his father had brought home the Christmas before he got sick, and she didn't see any reason to replace something that still worked. He sat on the couch on Christmas Eve and watched his mother move between the kitchen and the living room with the ease of a woman entirely at home in her own life, and he thought about what it cost a person to be at home in their own life. He had spent 42 years trying to build a life impressive enough to be at home in, and he had never once achieved the ease that his mother demonstrated in a 2-bedroom house in Dayton. "Tell me about the business," Sylvia said, settling into her chair with her tea. "And don't give me the investor version, give me the real one." He told her the real one. The lost clients, the Arthur Gaines trial quarter, the 2 people who had stayed, the therapy, the apartment in Stamford. He told her about the divorce proceeding, about how Emily had made no punitive claims, about how every action she had taken had been characterized by a generosity she had absolutely not been required to show. Sylvia listened to all of it. "She's a good woman," she said. "The best I've known," Thomas said. "Better than you deserved," Sylvia said with the specific precision of a mother who loves her son enough to tell him the truth. "Yes. Are you going to try to fix it?" Thomas looked at his mother. "I don't know if it can be fixed." "That wasn't what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm trying to fix myself first," he said, "like you told me." Sylvia looked at him for a long time with the eyes that had known him since before he knew himself. "Your father would be proud of you," she said, "not for the success you had, for what you're doing right now." Thomas looked at the artificial tree with its 23 years of familiar ornaments, and he did not trust himself to speak for a moment. "I miss him," he said. "I know," Sylvia said. "Me too." They sat together in the small living room, and the tree was lit, and the house smelled like the pot roast his mother always made on Christmas Eve, and Thomas thought about Gerald Caldwell coming home tired every evening, and sitting at the dinner table, and actually being there, and understood for the first time that his father had not been a failure. His father had been a success in every dimension that actually mattered, and Thomas had spent his entire life running from the man he should have been running toward. He drove back to Stamford on December 26th. January moved fast in the way of months that are full of actual work. The Arthur Gaines trial quarter concluded at the end of January, with numbers that Arthur's people reviewed and found to Thomas's cautious relief genuinely solid, not spectacular. Solid, reliable. The kind of numbers that are built on analysis, rather than connections that represent what the work actually was, rather than what the name attached to it could borrow. Arthur called on a Tuesday. "My people liked what they saw," Arthur said. "I'm glad. I want to talk about expanding the arrangement." Thomas kept his voice even. "I'm open to that. You're not going to try to oversell me." "No." "Good." A pause. "See you Thursday," Thomas told Sarah after the call. She looked up from her screen with the same expression she used for most good news, which was to say, an expression that acknowledged it without celebration. The expression of a woman who had learned to wait for the second quarter before calling anything a trend. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he confirmed. "That's good, Thomas." "It's a start," he said. She actually smiled this time, a real one. 2 days later, on a Thursday morning in late January, Thomas walked into the Arthur Gaines meeting with his portfolio analysis in a folder and his reputation rebuilt by nothing but the quality of the work itself. No borrowed networks, no name that opened rooms, just the numbers and the reasoning behind them. And he laid it out on the table and walked Arthur through it and answered every question directly. And when he left, he had a signed agreement for a full advisory relationship with the Gaines Foundation. He sat in his car in the parking lot for 3 minutes. He called no one. He did not post anything. He did not use it to prove something to the world or to himself. He simply sat with it, the knowledge that this had been earned entirely on its own terms, and felt something that was new and clean and different from every other professional success he had ever had. He felt like himself, the real one, not the performed version. He drove back to Stamford. That evening he cooked again. He had been cooking more, had started to find it grounding in a way he hadn't expected the simple physics of preparation, the way it required full attention and produced something tangible. He was making chicken and roasted vegetables, nothing elaborate, and he was listening to a playlist that included songs he hadn't listened to in years, songs from before Greenwich and Meridian and all the rest of it. Songs from when he was 28 and hungry and alive in the specific way of people who have not yet decided they have arrived. His phone rang. He almost didn't look. He had developed a habit of not looking at his phone when he was cooking, which was a very small habit but felt meaningful. He looked. It was a number he didn't recognize. New Haven area code. He answered. "Thomas Caldwell." "Mr. Caldwell." A woman's voice, professional measured. "This is Patricia Lund. I'm Emily's attorney." He turned off the stove. "Ms. Lund," he said, "what can I do for you?" "I'm calling because my client has asked me to pass along a communication. This is somewhat outside the standard channel for divorce proceedings, and I want to be clear that it's at Emily's specific request." "I understand." A pause. "Emily would like to know if you'd be willing to meet with her, in person, not for legal purposes. All of that will continue through proper channels. She would simply like to speak with you. She asked me to tell you that there is no pressure, no agenda, and that if you'd prefer not to, she will understand completely and will not contact you again outside of legal correspondence." Thomas stood in his kitchen with the phone in his hand and the stove off and the half-prepared dinner in front of him, and he was very, very still. "When?" he said. "Whenever is convenient for you. Emily is flexible." Of course she was. Of course. "Next week," he said. "Whatever day works for her. I'll let her know." A pause. "Mr. Caldwell, for what it's worth, I have handled a great many divorce cases, and I have rarely seen this level of care from either party. Whatever happened between you, I think you should know that." He thanked her. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen. I thought about what Emily might want to say. He had no idea. He had spent months trying not to project onto her, trying not to construct scenarios in his head where she forgave him or returned to him or told him it was all going to be fine, because all of those scenarios were about what he wanted and not what she needed, and he had done enough of that for one lifetime. But she wanted to see him. She had asked. He turned the stove back on. He finished cooking. He ate at the kitchen counter looking at the photograph on the wall, Emily in the garden, her hands in the clay, her face turned towards something just outside the frame. He thought about what she had been looking at in that photograph and realized that after all this time, all this reckoning, all these months of slowly dismantling and rebuilding and sitting with the uncomfortable truth of himself, he still didn't know. And for the first time, that felt right. Not knowing everything about Emily Hartwell, not having her fully understood and categorized and filed away. The not knowing felt like the beginning of something, the beginning of actually being curious about another person instead of certain about them. The meeting was set for the following Wednesday at a coffee shop in New Haven, not a restaurant, not a conference room. A coffee shop small and ordinary and without the trappings of power or occasion. Emily had chosen it. Of course she had. She had always known how to strip away the theater and find the real thing underneath. Thomas arrived 8 minutes early and sat at a table by the window, which was perhaps not a conscious choice, but which later he would find significant. She arrived at exactly the time they had agreed. She was wearing a dark coat, and her hair was down, and she walked through the door and looked around the room and found him immediately, and something in her face when she saw him was complicated and real and entirely unperformed. She sat down across from him. They looked at each other. The last time they had been in the same room was the night in the Greenwich house, the marble floors and the chandelier, and his arm pointed toward the door. This room was nothing like that room. 2 cups of coffee on a small table, and the sound of other people living their lives around them. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Emily," he said, and then stopped, because there was so much behind that word, her name, the 12 years, and the garden, and the soup in the refrigerator, and Margaret Whitmore's phone call, and all the rest of it, and he did not know how to start. She seemed to understand this. "I'll go first," she said. He nodded. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at them. Then she looked at him. "I'm not here to tell you everything is all right," she said. "It isn't. And I'm not here to forgive you in some formal way, because that's a process that happens in its own time and can't be announced." She paused. "But I am here because I spent 12 years with you, Thomas, and I know who you are underneath all the noise. And I have spent the last 3 months hearing things from Richard, from Margaret, from people in the community about what you've been doing." He waited. "You resigned from Meridian before the vote," she said. "You vacated the house a week early. You wrote me a note." She paused. "I read it many times." He had not expected that. He sat very still. "You started therapy," she continued. "You let most of your staff go gracefully. You're rebuilding with clients you earned. You went to see your mother for Christmas." She looked at him with those eyes, those steady, measuring, entirely honest eyes. "I know all of this because people tell me things. I didn't ask them to. They just do." "Emily." "I'm not finished," she said, not harshly, just precisely. He closed his mouth. "I also know about Olivia Bennett," she said. "I knew about her before the night you threw me out. I had known for about 4 months." The world went very quiet around Thomas. "You knew," he said. "Yes." "For 4 months." "Yes." "And you said nothing." She looked at him steadily. "What would you have done if I had said something?" He thought about that. He thought about the man he had been 4 months ago, the charcoal suit and the leather armchair and the certainty and the scotch. "I would have denied it," he said. "Yes," she said. "You would have. And then you would have resented me for bringing it up." She unfolded her hands. "So I waited, and I called Richard, and I let you make the decision that you were already making, because there is nothing in the world you can do to make a person choose the right thing. They have to get there themselves." He looked at her. "You were protecting me even then," he said. "Even when I was protecting myself," she said quietly. "There is a difference. I was protecting my own dignity, my own timeline." A pause. "I am not a St. Thomas. I want to be very clear about that. You are the most... I am a woman who was angry and hurt, and who handled it in the way that made sense to me. That is not the same as being a saint." He almost smiled, because that was Emily exactly and entirely refusing even the generous interpretation of herself. "Why did you want to meet?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "Because," she said, "I needed to see for myself whether what I was hearing was true, whether you had actually changed, or whether you were simply performing change because the situation required it." She held his gaze. "And I needed to tell you in person that what you said to me that night, nothing I needed you to know that it was not true. Not because I need your apology to know my own worth, but because I spent 2 years watching you say it with your actions before you ever said it out loud, and I want to know that you understand where it started, not with me, with you." The silence between them was full of everything. "I understand," he said. "I understand where it started." She nodded. She picked up her coffee cup. She drank. She set it down. Outside the window, New Haven moved through its Wednesday morning completely indifferent to the 2 people at the table by the window who were doing the hardest and most necessary work of their lives. "How is the business?" she asked. And just like that, the temperature in the room changed. Not warmer exactly, but different, realer. The practiced distance of the first part of the conversation settling into something that was almost 2 people who had known each other for 12 years, simply talking. "It's rebuilding," he said, slowly, honestly. "Good," she said, and she meant it. He could hear that she meant it. "How are you?" he asked. She considered the question with the care she always gave to questions people asked, without expecting a real answer. "I'm finding out," she said, "what it feels like to live without managing someone else's story." She paused. "It's quieter than I expected." "Is that good?" She thought about it. "Yes," she said. "I think so. I think I forgot what my own quiet sounded like. I thought about Margaret Whitmore's phone call, the guest room, the 2 a.m. crying that Emily would have been mortified to know he knew about. He did not bring it up. That was hers. He had no right to it. "Emily," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever the answer is, I will accept it." She waited. "Is there anything at all that I can do? Not to change what happened, not to change what's coming, but anything that would make any of this easier for you?" She looked at him. The question sat between them, honest and open, and without agenda. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something he had not expected. "Keep going," she said. "What you're doing, keep going. Not for me, for yourself, because I chose you 12 years ago, because I thought I saw someone real underneath all the noise." She held his gaze. "I want to have been right about that." He said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. She finished her coffee. She put on her coat. She picked up her bag. She stood. She looked at him one more time. "Take care of yourself, Thomas," she said. She walked to the door. She walked out into the January morning. He sat at the table by the window and he watched her go, and this time, unlike the night in Greenwich when he had watched the door close and felt like a king, he felt the full weight of everything. She was everything she had always been, everything he had failed to see. He did not feel like a king. He felt like a man who had been given, through no deserving of his own, one more honest look at the person he needed to become. He sat there for a long time after she was gone. Then he stood up. He buttoned his coat. He left a tip on the table that was more than the coffee warranted, because Emily had chosen this place, and it deserved the gesture, even if she would never know about it. He walked out into the January morning. He had work to do. He walked out of that coffee shop in New Haven with Emily's words sitting in his chest like something newly planted, fragile and real, and requiring care he had not yet proven he was capable of giving. "Keep going. Not for me, for yourself." He replayed it in the car at a stoplight, and then again on the Merritt Parkway, with the January landscape moving past him, gray and stripped and honest. She had not offered reconciliation. She had not offered forgiveness on a timeline. She had offered something more demanding than either of those things. She had offered him the standard she had always held him to quietly, without announcement, simply by being who she was. She expected him to become real. That was all. That was everything. He drove back to Stamford. He went to the office. He sat down at his desk and he worked until 7 o'clock, and then he drove home and he cooked and he went to bed and he woke up the next morning and did it again, and the day after that, and the day after that. Not because it was dramatic, not because anyone was watching, but because Emily Hartwell had looked at him across a coffee shop table and told him she wanted to have been right about him 12 years ago, and he was not going to let that be the last true thing said between them. February arrived fast and cold. The divorce was finalized on the 14th, Valentine's Day, which was either the universe's idea of a joke or simply the calendar being indifferent, and Thomas suspected the latter because the universe in his experience was far less interested in symbolism than people wanted it to be. Daniel called to confirm. Thomas said thank you. He sat with it for exactly as long as it took to understand that the document was real, the marriage was legally ended, and then he went back to work because there was nothing else to do with that feeling except let it be what it was and keep moving. He had a session with Dr. Elias that afternoon. He told Dr. Elias about the divorce finalization. He told him about the coffee shop meeting with Emily the week before. He told him for the first time about the soup in the refrigerator, the butternut squash soup with the handwritten label. November 3rd. Dr. Elias listened to all of it. "Why the soup?" Dr. Elias asked. Thomas thought about it. "Because it was so small," he said. "Everything else was big. The house, the money, the clients, Meridian. All of it felt enormous. But the soup was just she made soup, and she labeled it and put it in the back where it would keep. Nobody asked her to. Nobody noticed. She just did it." "Because that's who she was," Dr. Elias said. "Because that's who she was," Thomas agreed. "And I lived with that for 10 years, and I called it nothing." The silence in the room was the productive kind. "What did you call it today?" Dr. Elias asked. Thomas looked at the window. I called it the truest thing I've ever seen, he said. Someone taking care without needing credit for it. Someone doing the real work of love without requiring an audience. And what does that tell you about what you've been doing this past 3 months? Thomas was quiet. It tells me I'm learning, he said finally. I'm learning to do things without needing an audience. I'm not all the way there, but I'm learning. Dr. Elias wrote something. Thomas still didn't ask what. March came. The Arthur Gaines relationship had expanded into a full advisory contract in February, and in March, Thomas landed 2 new clients through nothing but referrals from Arthur's network people who had heard from Arthur himself that Thomas Caldwell's work was worth trusting. Not Thomas Caldwell's connections, not Thomas Caldwell's name or his board seat or his Greenwich address, his work, the analysis, the honest numbers. He hired 1 new staff member in March, a young analyst named Dio, who had 3 years of experience and the kind of focused precision that Thomas had once valued in others only when it served his own agenda, and now valued because it was simply excellent. He told Dio on her first day what he had told his remaining staff back in November, that this firm was rebuilding on the quality of its work and nothing else, and that if she ever felt that standard slipping, he wanted to know. She had looked at him with the healthy skepticism of someone who has heard speeches before. "I'll hold you to that," she said. "Good," he said. She was within 6 weeks the best hire he had ever made. Sarah noticed. "She's remarkable," Sarah told him one afternoon. "Yes," he said. "You actually listened to her in the team meeting yesterday. Properly listened. Changed your position based on what she said." He looked at Sarah. "Is that unusual?" he asked. Sarah gave him a look that contained approximately 3 years of history. "Let's just say it's an improvement," she said. He took that. April brought the Boston Conference, the Harrington Financial Leadership Summit, 3 days at the Marriott Copley Place. The kind of event Thomas had attended for 15 years as a centerpiece and was now attending as someone who was rebuilding from the periphery. He almost didn't go. He had debated it with himself for 2 weeks, gone back and forth about whether showing up in a room full of people who knew what had happened was worth whatever could come from it. Dr. Elias, when he raised it in session, said simply, "What are you afraid of?" "Being defined by what happened," Thomas said. "And if you don't go," Thomas thought about it, "I let what happened define me by absence instead of presence." Which is worse. He registered for the conference. He drove to Boston on a Wednesday morning. He checked into the hotel. He attended the first day of sessions with the deliberate low-key presence of a man who is there to learn and not to be seen, and it was uncomfortable and also clarifying because several people who had known him when he was at full elevation treated him with a wariness that was honest and deserved, and he accepted that without fighting it or performing his way through it. He had dinner alone on Wednesday night. Thursday morning he was at the first session when he saw her. He almost missed her. She was near the back of the room, which was not where Emily Hartwell typically positioned herself in any gathering, but was where she had put herself now, and she was talking to a woman he didn't recognize, and she was laughing at something, and the laugh was real, and for a moment Thomas simply stood in the doorway of the conference room and watched her be okay without him. She was more than okay. She was herself. Fully freely, without the particular tension that had been present in the coffee shop, the careful self-management of a woman navigating a difficult conversation with a person she had reason not to trust. She was at ease. She was comfortable. She was in a room of her professional peers, doing the thing she was extraordinarily good at, which was being exactly who she was, with no performance attached. He went to a different seat. He did not approach her. He told himself he was giving her space. He told himself it was the right thing. He told himself a lot of things during that Thursday morning session that he mostly believed. At the coffee break, she found him. He was standing near the back of the room, watching the crowd holding a coffee he hadn't drunk, and he heard her voice before he saw her move toward him. "Thomas!" He turned. She was 3 feet away. She looked at him with those eyes, and he waited for whatever came next. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said. "I wasn't sure I was coming until last week," he said. She nodded, looked at his coffee cup. "You haven't drunk that?" "No." Nervous. He considered denying it, chose not to. A little. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. Not quite not one. "How is the business?" she asked. "Growing," he said. "Slowly. 2 new clients in March. A new hire who is better than me in several important ways." "That's good." "It's very good," he said. "I'm trying to make a habit of surrounding myself with people who will tell me when I'm wrong." She looked at him steadily. "That's a significant change." "Yes," he said, "it is." They stood with the crowd moving around them, the conference noise and the coffee smell, and the very ordinary, extraordinary fact of them standing in the same room again without lawyers between them. "I'm glad you came," she said. Then carefully, "I don't mean—" "I know what you mean," he said. "I'm glad too." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a professional exchange. Then she said, "I'm on a panel this afternoon, 2 o'clock, if you happen to be in that room." It was not an invitation exactly. It was also not an invitation. "I'll look for it in the program," he said. She walked away. He drank the cold coffee in one long swallow. He was in the room at 1:55. Emily's panel was on sustainable philanthropy and the role of family foundations in long-term community investment, and she was, as he had always privately known and never publicly acknowledged, extraordinarily good at this. She spoke without notes. She answered questions with the kind of confidence that doesn't come from rehearsal, but from actual knowledge from years of thinking carefully about a thing that matters. The other panelists were accomplished people. She was the one the audience kept looking at. He watched her from the third row. He watched people lean forward when she spoke. He watched the moderator return to her when the conversation needed grounding. He watched Emily Hartwell be in public, and without any effort, the most substantial person in the room. He had lived with this woman for 10 years and hosted dinner parties where he had done most of the talking. He sat with the full, uncomfortable weight of that. After the panel, there was a small reception. He almost left. He decided to stay, not to find Emily, not to manufacture a moment, but because leaving felt like a retreat, and he had made a decision somewhere in the last few months to stop retreating from discomfort. He was talking to Arthur Gaines, who had also appeared at the conference, and greeted Thomas with a warmth that felt genuinely earned when Emily approached them. She and Arthur knew each other. Of course they did. She had known Arthur's father. It emerged from the foundation world, and they fell into a conversation about a community land trust project in Hartford that Emily was advising on, and Thomas listened rather than spoke, and it was the most interesting conversation he had been part of in years. Arthur looked at him at one point and said, "Your man here has been doing good work." Emily glanced at Thomas. "I've heard," she said. "Solid numbers," Arthur said. "More importantly, solid thinking. He stopped trying to impress me around month 2 and just started showing me good analysis. Made all the difference." Emily looked at Thomas with an expression he could not entirely decode, but that felt somewhere underneath the layers like something close to what she had said in the coffee shop. "I want to have been right." "I'm going to get another drink," Arthur said with the particular discretion of a 68-year-old man who has been in enough rooms to know when 2 people need to be left alone. He walked away. Thomas and Emily stood together. "He's a good man," Emily said. "He is," Thomas said. "He gave me a chance I hadn't earned yet. I've been trying to earn it retroactively." "That's how it usually works," she said. A pause. "Emily," he said. He had not planned to say anything in particular. He said it anyway because the conference and the panel and Arthur's words and 4 months of rebuilding had brought him to a place where the thing needed saying. "I want you to know something. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying it to ask for anything or to change anything that has already been decided. I'm saying it because it's true, and you deserve to hear it stated plainly." She waited. "You are the most capable, most genuine, most quietly extraordinary person I have ever known," he said. "And I spent 2 years making you feel like you weren't enough. That was the greatest mistake of my life. Not losing the house or the board seat or the clients, failing to see you, that was the mistake." The room was loud around them, glasses clinking and conversations overlapping, and the general noise of 100 professionals at the end of a conference day. Emily was very still. "I know," she said quietly, "and I want you to know that I heard you say that." She paused. "And I believe you mean it." "I do." She looked at him. "Thomas," she said, and something in the way she said his name was different from the coffee shop, different from the conference hallway, different from every version of his name she had said in 10 years of marriage. It was careful and weighted, and underneath all of that fragile in the way that things are fragile when they matter. "I need more time," she said. "I need more time to know who you are becoming. Not who you say you are, who you are." He nodded. "I understand." "I'm not saying no," she said. "I'm not saying yes. I'm saying I need time and I need to see. Can you live with that?" He looked at her. I thought about the man he had been a year ago, who could not have lived with that, who would have pressed and pushed and needed resolution on his own timeline, because ambiguity was uncomfortable and discomfort was intolerable. He thought about Dr. Elias and his mother and Sarah and Howard and the Arthur Gaines trial quarter and the apartment in Stamford and the photograph on the wall and the soup in the refrigerator that nobody ever asked Emily about and that she made anyway because that was who she was. "Yes," he said, "I can live with that." She nodded. She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she said, "Get some sleep tonight, Thomas. You look like you've been working too hard." And there it was. Not forgiveness declared, not a door opened or closed, just Emily being Emily, caring in the precise and unsentimental and entirely genuine way she had always cared, noticing the thing that needed noticing and saying it plainly and expecting nothing back. He almost laughed. "I will," he said. She walked back into the crowd. He stood where she had left him, and he breathed. The conference ended Thursday evening. Thomas drove back to Stamford on Friday morning. He stopped at a diner somewhere on 91 because he was hungry and because he had learned slowly to stop when he needed to stop instead of pushing through everything in the name of productivity. He sat at the counter and ordered eggs and coffee and ate without looking at his phone, watching the Friday morning regulars come and go, people with nowhere particular to be or somewhere very particular to be, carrying their ordinary lives with the unself-conscious ease of people who have not recently had to dismantle and rebuild themselves. I thought about the conversation with Emily. "I need more time. I need to see who you are becoming." He turned it over, examined it. Not for strategy, not for hidden meaning, not for the angle he might use. Just held it the way you hold something that is both fragile and real. She had not closed the door. She had not opened it either. She had stood in the doorway, which was where Emily Hartwell had always done her most important work, in the in-between places, the waiting spaces, the places where most people rush to resolution, and she simply stood and waited for the truth to declare itself. He paid for his breakfast. He left a good tip. He drove back to Stamford. May arrived. The firm had 7 clients, now all earned through work and reputation and the slow, patient accumulation of trust that has no shortcut. Marcus Webb at Fenwick called in the second week of May. Thomas had not reached out again after his initial message in November. He had waited as he had learned to wait. "I've been watching," Marcus said without preamble. "I know," Thomas said. "Arthur Gaines speaks well of you." "Arthur has been generous." "Arthur is not generous," Marcus said. "He's accurate. There's a difference." A pause. "I want to have a conversation about Fenwick's options." Thomas kept his voice level. "I'd welcome that." "Next week, my office." "Name the day." He told Sarah after the call. She looked up from her screen. She set down her pen, which she had never done for any piece of news Thomas had ever delivered. "Marcus Webb," she said. "Next week." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's not just a client, Thomas." "I know. That's a signal to the entire community. If Marcus Webb comes back." "I know, Sarah." She picked up her pen. She looked at her screen. Then she looked back at him. "Don't oversell it," she said. "Go in there and show him the actual work. Nothing else." "That's the only thing I know how to do anymore," he said. And he meant it. The Fenwick meeting was on a Tuesday. Thomas arrived with his analysis, with his numbers, with the track record of 7 months of work that had no borrowed authority behind it. He sat across from Marcus Webb, and he laid it out, and he answered every question directly. And when Marcus asked him the one question Thomas had been carrying since November, he answered that directly too. Marcus said, "What happened, Thomas, in your own words, not the professional version?" Thomas said, "I confused the foundation someone else built with something I had made myself. I confused a good woman's belief in me with my own accomplishment. And when the mirror she was holding up stopped showing me what I wanted to see, I called it her failure instead of my blindness." He paused. "It took me losing everything to understand what everything actually was." Marcus looked at him for a long time. "Edmund Hartwell told me once," Marcus said, "that the most dangerous man in any room is the one who believes his success is entirely self-made, because that man will never understand what he owes, and a man who doesn't understand what he owes cannot be trusted." Thomas held his gaze. "I understand what I owe," Thomas said. "I may not be able to repay all of it, but I understand it." Marcus Webb nodded once. He signed the agreement before Thomas left the building. Summer came to Stamford, the way summer comes to New England suddenly without apology, replacing the gray with something bright that almost hurts after so many months of cold. Thomas noticed it in the way he was noticing more things now, the details and textures of ordinary life that he had spent 15 years moving through too fast to see. He was on the phone with his mother on a Saturday morning in June when she said something that stopped him. "Tommy," Sylvia said, "you sound different." "Different how?" "Like yourself," she said. "The real one. The boy who used to sit on the porch and watch the neighborhood and ask me questions about everybody who walked by." A pause. "You stopped asking questions somewhere along the way. You started just knowing things." "I had a lot of help stopping," he said. "No," she said firmly. "You made choices. Other people may have encouraged them, but you made them. Own what's yours." She paused. "That's how you own what comes next, too." He drove to Dayton in July and spent a week. He helped his mother paint the kitchen, which had needed it for 3 years. He fixed the back porch step that had been soft since his father's last summer. He sat with his mother in the evenings and watched the neighborhood and asked questions about the people walking by, the way he used to, and Sylvia answered each one with the encyclopedic local knowledge of a woman who had lived in one place long enough to know its whole story. He came back to Stamford rested in a way that had nothing to do with hours slept. The letter arrived in early August, not from a lawyer, not from a professional contact, handwritten on plain paper in the careful and distinctive handwriting he would have recognized anywhere. It said, "Thomas, I've been thinking about what you said in Boston. I've been thinking about what I said. I've also been watching as I told you I would. I talked to Arthur last week. I talked to Marcus. I talked to Sarah, who I think you should know is extremely loyal to you in the specific way that people are loyal to someone who has genuinely changed rather than someone who is performing change." She said, and I am quoting her directly, "He listens now. He actually listens." She said it like it was the most important thing. I think it might be. I am not writing to suggest anything specific. I am writing because I told you I needed time and I wanted you to know that time is doing what it is supposed to do. I am writing because I still think about the garden. I planted dahlias this spring. They came up. I thought you should know. Emily. He read the letter 3 times. He sat at the kitchen counter in the Stamford apartment under the photograph of Emily, with her hands in the Connecticut clay. Her face turned towards something just outside the frame, and he read the letter a 4th time. She planted dahlias. They came up. He thought about what it meant, that she was in the garden again, that she was planting things again, that she was in a place where she wanted to grow something and watch it live. He thought about what it meant that she had told him. He got up. He went to his desk. He found paper, plain paper, because he did not own stationery and had never thought to, and he sat down and he wrote back. He wrote Emily, "Thank you for telling me about the dahlias. I want you to know that I think about the garden too. I think about a lot of things I should have thought about when they were right in front of me. I am not writing to ask for anything or to suggest anything specific either. I am writing because you took the time and because you deserve a response in kind. The firm has 8 clients now, all earned. Sarah told me last week that Howard has started smiling at staff meetings, which apparently means something. I am seeing Dr. Elias every week still. I have learned to cook 4 things well. I helped my mother paint her kitchen in July. I am learning to ask questions instead of assuming I already know the answers. It is slower than I expected and better. I hope the dahlias keep coming. Thomas." He folded the letter. He found an envelope. He addressed it to Emily's Boston apartment, which Richard had mentioned in passing months ago. He mailed it the next morning. He did not know what she would write back. He did not know what came next between them, whether the door would open further or remain exactly where it was, whether the carefully tended ground between them would grow into something or simply remain what it was, 2 people who had hurt each other and were learning separately and honestly to become who they should have been all along. He did not know. And he was learning finally to live in the not knowing without trying to force it into resolution, to tend the thing instead of demanding the harvest. That was where Thomas Caldwell was 1 year after the worst night of his life, when he had stood in the living room of a house that wasn't his and pointed at the door and called Emily Hartwell nothing. I was in an apartment in Stamford with a photograph on the wall and a letter in the mail, and 8 clients who trusted the work, and a therapist who asked the right questions, and a mother who told him the truth, and 2 staff members who stayed because they saw something real, and a young analyst named Dio, who was better than him in several important ways, and whom he thanked for it every time. He was doing the work. Not the impressive kind, not the kind that gets you a board seat or a Greenwich address, or the admiring attention of rooms full of people who want to be near power. The other kind. The slow, unglamorous, entirely necessary work of becoming someone whose foundation is his own. Someone who asks instead of assumes. Someone who listens instead of performs. Someone who plants things and waits and tends them without demanding they grow faster than they are able. He was not there yet. He knew that. But he was going. And for the first time in his life, going was enough, because the man walking forward was real, and the ground under his feet was his own, and he had built it from the only material that ever actually holds the hard, unglamorous, unwitnessed truth of who you are when no one is giving you credit for it. That was what Emily Hartwell had always known, and it was the most important thing Thomas Caldwell ever learned.